SpaceX shared today that Starship completed its rehearsal for launch, loading more than 10 million pounds of propellant on Starship and Super Heavy and taking the flight-like countdown to T-minus 10 seconds. Elon just shared this on X this morning, saying Starship Flight 3 preparing for launch. So yes, you can bet that I'll be headed back to Boca Chica pretty soon. The real question is when, and while the FAA has announced that SpaceX has completed their mishap investigation, they only have 17 corrective actions. Compare that to the 63 that they had after the first launch. We still don't have an FAA launch license yet, but you know that that is on the way. I interviewed Dr. Phil Metzger recently about Starship, talking about the upcoming flight. I also talked to Ozan, who has his own unique information and perspective about the Starship program. So I hope you enjoy these interviews. I just went down to Starbase. And I actually thought about you because I went to my favorite hibachi place down there, and some locals struck up a conversation with me. And, you know, one of the husband or whatever said, oh, yeah, after that first launch, you know, there was just dust for days and, you know, just covered everything. And it was all Starship's fault. And you've kind of told me maybe that's not the case based on like collecting the samples.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was sand that fell from the sky in Port Isabel. So 4 different people sent samples to us, and we analyzed the samples. There were two questions about human health, and then one question about what the heck happened, so that we can figure out how to prevent it. The human health questions was, what is it made out of? Is it asbestos or something hazardous?
Right.
And the second human health question was, how big are the particles? Because if they're small, like 10 microns or finer, then they could be a respiration hazard. And what we found out is they were just normal beach sand. It was literally the sand that was under the launch pad that landed on Port Isabel. So wow. when it blew apart the launch pad, the concrete did not get broken into fine enough pieces to go that far. So none of the concrete went to Port Isabel. The only thing that went to Port Isabel was sand. And so what that tells us is that the launch pad did not break up into small pieces. It only broke up into big pieces. Okay, and so that's good. So there was no chemical hazard to human health in Port Isabel. The second thing was the size. And they turned out that it was basically just the size of beach sand. They were like 200 to 500 microns, which is the size of a sand grain. They were not 10 microns. Now, we did find some that were as fine as 10 or 5 microns. There was a tiny amount, but that's not a problem, because beach sand, you're allowed to have some exposure level to real fine particles. And this was so far below the hazardous limit that's set by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It's so far below that limit that tiny amount wasn't a problem. But even more importantly is the exposure time was super short. The sand fell from the sky for less than a minute, from what I've been told. And so these OSHA limits are based on exposure for 8 hours a day, every day, for a 20 or 30-year career. So 1 minute of exposure once in your life is really nothing. But then, but it's even less exposure than a minute, because it's really no exposure happened. The reason why is because the sand was actually contained in water droplets. You could see pictures of the sand falling from the sky on computer screens, and they would make diagonal streaks down the screen like water droplets, leaving the dust specks in a diagonal streak. And people reported that they felt the sand landing on them, and it felt like water. But then when they brushed it, it was dry sand. And when it landed on their shirt, it would make a dark spot like a raindrop. But when they brushed it, it was dry sand. Well, what happened was it actually was water. So that cloud that left the launch pad, that cloud was a cloud of water vapor that actually was the rocket exhaust. The rocket exhaust made a lot of water. and the conditions for rain on that day were not favoring rain, and so you made a cloud of water on a day that wanted to be dry, and so it would not have rained, except that there was also sand blown into the cloud. The sand was circulating around because it was a hot cloud, so it had circulation, and that kept the sand from falling out. But the sand started to seed the cloud and made raindrops form around the sand grains. And so when the drops grew big enough, then they fell out of the cloud. And the drops that fell out of the cloud had the sand grains inside of them. And so there was no dust blowing in the air. It was sand grain that had been stuck together by water hitting the ground. So completely no respiration hazard whatsoever. But it was really cool for us as scientists to see, wow, that really happened. Nobody ever thought you could make a rainstorm with sandy raindrops from a rocket launch.
Right.
That in the history of the world, nothing like that has ever happened before. But also, then the last question was, so what the heck happened? And that's how we figured out, well, it cracked the pad. Once it cracked the pad, the high pressure gas drove hot gas under the pad, which vaporized the groundwater mixed in the sand. And that buildup of pressure exploded the launch pad. And so the sand that was under the launch pad got blown up into the sky. And that was the sand that fell on Port Isabel. So it was pretty cool from a physics perspective. We learned things. We never knew you could explode a launch pad. But now that we know it, we know that we have to prevent it on the moon. And so we're actually working on ways to prevent launch pads on the moon from exploding. So we actually learned something really important out of this. But we did prove it was not a health hazard, this stuff that fell on Port Isabel.
SpaceX recently sort of released details about the conclusion of their mishap investigation and sort of their version of what went wrong during Flight 2. I know you have a lot of opinions about this. So what did you think about their explanation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of speculation still going on. I think there's still a lot of room for interpretation. It seems like there were multiple factors that contributed to the Super Heavy red and also to the Starship explosion. And so they have corrective actions along a number of fronts. One of them is control. So, last time that we were on your show, Scott and I had talked about the difficulty of doing that staging without unsettling propellants, right? And having the pushback from the upper stage, unsettling the first stage's propellants so that, you could have engine cut out. And it does seem like they are addressing engine control, slosh, as well as there's interesting speculation about what it means that they have clogged filters that caused that loss of pressure that caused one engine to go out, and then that seems to be the big thing,
right?
On Super Heavy. And yeah, the speculation, I don't know if you've heard of it, but the speculation is that they're actually using the pre-burner exhaust. So Raptor is a stage combustion engine with an oxygen pre-burner and a methane side pre-burner. The oxygen pre-burner basically uses mostly oxygen with a little bit of methane to kind of partially combust that oxygen, bring it up to a very high temperature at high pressures to then drive the oxygen pump. And then all the exhaust from that would normally go directly to the main combustion chamber. Now, the expectation was that they would, Starship is also using autogenous pressurization, so they're using gaseous oxygen and gaseous methane to pressurize the oxygen and methane tanks. And of course, you need more of those gases as the tanks are being emptied, and you need more of those gases than you can get with just natural boil off in the tanks. So you kind of have to pump gas back into the tanks. The expectation was that they were using heat exchangers to get some of the heat from the oxygen preburner to boil some additional oxygen and pump that back into the oxygen tank. But it seems like what they might be doing, at least on the oxygen side, is tapping off a little bit of the pre-burner exhaust directly into the main oxygen tank. Now, when this theory first came out, there was a lot of pushback against it, and I was also incredulous. There's a very good reason not to do this, and the reason is that you do have a little bit of water and carbon dioxide in that pre-burner exhaust, right? So it's mostly oxygen, mostly hot oxygen, which is what you want, but you also have some combustion products, and those combustion products will freeze when they come in contact with the cold surfaces in the oxygen tank. So the upper dome, the downcomer, some of the sidewalls, and basically the pool of liquid oxygen at the bottom of the tank. And then you will get, chunks of frozen carbon dioxide and water, so water ice and dry ice, either stuck to the walls or floating around. The dry ice will sink, the water ice will float, and that's stuff that your engine, your pumps don't want to ingest, right? You normally wouldn't want to ingest like chunks of ice. Excuse me. So this seems like a really bad idea. Why wouldn't you just use a heat exchanger? And their speculation is like, oh, maybe it's performance reasons, but I didn't really buy that, because a heat exchanger will get you almost as good performance. And it seems like it might have been a part reduction issue. And the more I thought about this, the more it made sense even from a reliability perspective, because what the heat exchanger is basically a bunch of cooling channels where you have hot oxygen running through it. And when you have 33 Raptors on Super Heavy, if any one of those cooling channels leaks, you have hot oxygen gas injection into an area that's fuel rich and has bare metal. So it's perfect for starting a fire. So if you can reduce those pipes, then it might counterintuitively have a positive impact on reliability, as well as cost and simplicity and all of that. Even though you also have the added risk from chunks of ice floating around in your tanks. And the other big objection that I had was, well, once you have that ice, it's like with every refill, it should build up unless you drain it, right? Unless you melt the ice or evaporate the ice and drain it. And if you want quick turnarounds, that's not really that's not a problem you want to have, right? You want to be able to fill up and go. And at some point, you're going to have to clean those tanks. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, well, actually, it may not be all that difficult to drain those tanks. I was thinking about a couple of different options, and one of the things that you could do is just drain the oxygen, and then you just have ice sitting in there, a lot of which may have actually melted at that point. Or even, if you're coming with super heavy, since you're landing with the heather tanks, you could probably vent a lot of the gas from the main tanks on the way down. So you might avoid at least some of that ice buildup. Mm-hmm. And then it's also going to be heating up on the way down a little bit. So that might help. But then once you're down on the ground, if you drain the oxygen, if you're already made peace with having water in your tanks and your plumbing, you could pump hot water in there, boil off the CO2, melt the water ice, and then just drain the rest of the water. And maybe you don't care so much about drying it completely, since you're going to put ice back in there anyway. So you just drain the water after you drain the oxygen, and then you make sure your valves are dry so that they don't get stuck. Refill your propellant, and you're ready to go. Maybe it doesn't have to take that long. So I don't know, that's maybe a longer answer than you wanted, but I've heard enough rumors that this is actually what's going on that I'm like, okay, it hasn't been fully confirmed, but that would be very interesting, very counterintuitive, kind of like the switch to steel, or the catching arms But when you give it some thought, it's like, okay, I can see why they might have done that, and maybe it's going to work out for the best in the end.
Right. And if I remember correctly, after the first launch, there were 63 corrective actions. And then after the second one, there were 17.
Yeah.
So that's probably
I think they're getting close.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
We think Flight 3 might be, you know, somewhere around March 14th. Do you think that, you know, we're going to see the same issues?
I don't think we'll see the same issues. I mean, I think we might see a few of the same issues, but you know, just as we saw a huge improvement from Flight 1 to Flight 2, and you know, failures at different points due mostly to different things, I think it'll probably be, you know, worst case. Well, no, worst case it blows up on the pad, right? That's always a possibility. Right. But I think I believe that Elon estimate of, you know, 70 to 80% chance of making orbit, and if it fails to do that, it will probably fail for a different set of reasons than what we saw on Flight 2.
Let's hope not. Problems are trending. It's hard to get into orbit.
Yeah.
And we know that, you know, this year they want to launch 9 times.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, at least 9 was, I think, the wording, right?
Right. So one of the threads that you had on X was the cost associated with Starships and building these. Do you want to kind of summarize in a, you know, in a simple way?
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Simple. Yeah. So one thing that I keep hearing from people who want to be level-headed about this program, they're like, okay, yeah, we get it. SpaceX is very successful. They'll eventually get this right, and they'll get full reuse. But it's not going to be anywhere near the, you know, $2 million or $3 million or $1 million you know, cost that you know, Elon Musk is talking about. And you know, it would be amazing if it was $100 million. And I always, that always bothers me a little, because it just feels like people are just making up numbers for the sake of making up numbers. Like I get the desire to be sensible, but it's pretty hard to break down the costs in a way that you would get to $100 million.
You're saying it's much more.
I'm saying it's much less.
Oh, less. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, much less. So I actually think that, well, you know, I won't talk about what I think the cost is actually going to be before I talk about why it's not going to be anywhere near $100 million. But first, you know, let's talk about what we mean when we say cost. So when SpaceX and Elon Musk talk about marginal cost, what they're talking about is, yeah, we're spending all this money. We have all this infrastructure. We have all these employees. We've invested so much in this, and we're continuing to invest on an annual basis in keeping this program going. What does it cost to add an extra launch? Mm-hmm. And that's a very important figure, because that determines how low you can bid on a contract and still make money from it.
Right.
So when people talk about, you know, how, you know, pricing things, one of the things that they often don't think about is that you don't have to give the same price to everybody. And in the launch business, you don't. In most businesses, you don't. You know, you have low-end versions of your product or your services, your whatever you're offering, that cost a lot less than your high-end stuff to your customer. But the difference is actually not that big for you. Mm-hmm. You're trying to, you use the high-end stuff to cover most of your fixed costs, because you know, the high-end businesses are usually high margin. You can make a lot of money off of those, but you're still willing to sell a slightly worse version of your product at, you know, something pretty close to what it costs you to make it, for the people who will buy that and nothing more, right? So if there's a market for an $8 million launch and it costs you $5 million per launch, even if it costs you like $5 billion to keep your infrastructure going, if it costs you $5 million to add that extra launch, you have no incentive to say, no, I don't want to bid for that $8 million launch unless you think that it's going to somehow interfere with the rest of your business. But it doesn't have to, right? You can use Starship to bid for a 2-ton launch that a small launcher could launch, and you can use Starship to bid for a 50-ton launch and charge vastly different prices for that, right?
Right.
I mean, this is basically what we see with Transporter. SpaceX does not make nearly as much money off of Transporter as they do off of a government launch or even a commercial launch that uses most of the capabilities of an F9.
Right.
And I think that difference is likely to get even more dramatic with Starship. So they might charge, $200 million for one kind of launch that only Starship can do. But they might also, if they can get their costs low enough, marginal cost, they might also charge, $5 million, $6 million to compete with an Electron. Well, that's the big if. Can they get it low enough? And I think that there's a path for it. But when we talk about like $100 million, is that the price? Well, the price is going to be all over the place, and it's going to depend on the market, on what's the competition, how much demand is there, all that stuff. But what really matters, I think, in terms of long-term cost, like lowering cost of access, and what it means for the competition is how low can SpaceX go?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the relevant figure, and that's where I think that 100 million is very unrealistic for a fully reusable system.
Right. What do you think is the more accurate? What do you think Starship is costing right now? I know that's like kind of hard to answer. And then where do you think we'll be in, let's say, I don't know, 5 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we've heard Elon say, I think, in relation to the full stack launches was it was like $50 to $100 million per launch. And, that might be an optimistic figure. But that is for a full stack still in the development phase. And that's not, everything that it took to get to that launch. It's, again, marginal cost, right? Mm-hmm. Is what what they built and what it took to get it to the launch pad and fly it.
Right.
All the labor around operations, fueling, et cetera, and repairs, perhaps, on ground infrastructure. Well, not after IFT-1, but maybe IFT-2. Now that's for a fully reusable, or what's intended to be a fully reusable stack. A lot of the cost of the upper stage has to do with that reuse hardware. Right. So if you just took away all of that, you would not only get vastly better performance because you're not carrying all that stuff to space, but you would also have lower cost. So I think if they wanted to go with a fully expendable stack, it would probably cost somewhere on the order of $100 million for them, possibly a lot less as they streamline their operations. And it would have nearly twice the performance that people are expecting from a fully reusable Starship.
Right.
So that already kind of gives us a sense of if they want to keep, if they want to make a reusable vehicle, they're not going to make one that is half as performant as an expendable vehicle that they could make tomorrow and cost the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also a very trivial path to getting a semi-reusable, kind of like Falcon 9, with Starship performance, with 100 to 150 tons to LEO, expending just 3 Raptors per flight, and a smaller amount of tankage, none of that reuse hardware. And as I've looked at what would it cost to build that, how many launches could they do with the amount of infrastructure they already have for engine production, for tank production, they might have to take resources from one area, no more TPS tiles, no more of this or that, and more tank domes and things like that. But basically, we're looking at something pretty close to Falcon 9 costs, amazingly, for a semi-reusable Starship stack with 100 to 150 tons to low Earth orbit with 3 Raptors, 3 sea level Raptors. You can basically fly The first stage has 33 Raptors. You can fly 3 Raptors on 11 flights on the first stage, and then retire them with a farewell flight on the upper stage, right? So you just have this production where you just have this pipeline where you're just adding 3 Raptors to Super Heavy and then taking them out and burning them up in the upper stage every time. So you only burn like 3 Raptors, and they only have to fly 12 times, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what people don't realize, I think what people don't often think about is that a sea level Raptor has almost the same ISB as a Merlin vacuum engine.
Wow.
So it's actually, it's pretty decent as an upper stage engine.
Right.
And it's enough to get you that 100 to 150 tons with 3 engines. You kind of want a little bit less tankage so you don't have too much loft, but that's not a problem. That also means lower upper stage cost. And this is what return to landing site of the booster. So
right.
Yeah, and with how cheap they've gotten tank production, all the stuff that you can eliminate, autogenous pressurization, meaning you don't have helium and helium tanks to worry about. Avionics does not scale up in cost, really, not much. You can basically get it down to Falcon 9-ish costs, maybe like 1 to 2 times the cost of a Falcon 9 with a drone ship recovery for maybe 6 to 12 times the performance.
Wow.
Depending on how aggressive you get. If you do downrange recovery, if you do nozzle extensions on those Raptors, if you shave a little more weight, you're taking advantage of lower thrust and lower propellant mass in the upper stages, and do all these little optimizations and go to V3 Raptors, you can push that thing well over 200 tons with 3 Raptors.
That's great.
It's like people talk about order of magnitude reduction in cost with Starship through reuse. Well, it's already looking at close to order of magnitude reduction in cost through manufacturing cost reduction and scale.
Right.
It's an extra order of magnitude reduction in cost through full reuse. So I think that kind of gives us a sense of somewhere in the range of maybe $20 to $50 million, not marginal cost, but like average cost. So including the fixed cost, if you're flying this thing over 100 times a year, because they basically already have the engine manufacturing capability to do over 100 partially reusable flights a year. Wow. Right? Like that's
it's crazy. It's crazy to think about. And I haven't, our live stream was several months ago, so forgive me, but you clearly know a lot about this. For viewers who don't know who you are, why do you have such an extensive background in this?
Oh, I'm just one of those space nerds. I'm a software engineer with a little bit of an electrical engineering background, but like I'm an aerospace nerd. I just like learning about the stuff on the side, and I like the math and physics of it. So I've just picked stuff up along the way and written some code for my own edification to kind of simulate this stuff and play around with it.
And what is your day job?
I'm actually semi-retired at this point. So my wife and I switched roles. So I've got the house, and she's the breadwinner as of I think about coming up on something like 2 years ago.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you have like incredible knowledge on this. Way more than I do. But a lot of my viewers do. So I think they'll enjoy hearing about this. Is there anything else that you want to talk about that maybe you haven't seen talked about Starship, and or just any more final comments you want to make about, it's just such an exciting time. We're like at the beginning stages of, something truly transformative.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are a lot of people who are realistically skeptical, and there are a lot of people who are unrealistically credulous about some of the timelines that are given or some of the promises that are made, and it's hard to navigate. But I just wish that people would have a little bit more of an open mind and kind of do the math, check things out a little bit more before coming to conclusions about, oh, this won't work or this will never. The answer often tends to be a lot of things are possible, but they're hard, and so they'll probably take a long time.
Right.
And I just wish that there was more of that nuance in the community. But yeah, I think just getting back to Starship, I do think that there's a path to low single-digit million marginal launch cost, and eventually launch prices that are not too much higher than that if the competition arrives. And I also think that there's, if it doesn't go below, say, about $20 million, then SpaceX will have no reason to keep Starship flying. Like, I think it's fine to be skeptical that they'll ever get it working. I mean, I'm not. I think that they will. But it doesn't make sense to me to say, oh yeah, they'll get it working, but it'll never go down below 100 million. Like, it's right. They might not sell it below 100 million for a while, but I think internally it'll be pretty cheap for them to launch the next one.
But will they ever get those chopsticks to catch a booster?
That's a great question. And I think that's another one of those things where it's like, it's physically possible. It's not as hard of a control problem as people think it is, because those boosters can hover, unlike the F9. They can throttle down low enough that they can hover in place, so you don't need to just stick the landing on the first try. So you can get kind of close, and then from there you basically, like, it doesn't have to be a super precise inertial navigation system or anything like that to get you on those mounts, on the chopsticks, because you can basically use radar right there to have millimetric precision, like know exactly where the booster is and inch it into place with either your super precise electric throttle, thrust vector control system, which they're fitting on all the new Raptors. Well, not all the ones that thrust vector. They're not hydraulic anymore. They've got electric actuators, or you can use your reaction control system, little bursts of, I think at this point it's called gold gas, to just nudge the vehicle into place. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think that it's that hard. Now, will they get it right the first time? I don't know. But I think that it's a very solvable problem.
Well, you might know the answer. This might be a dumb question, but you might know the answer. Let's say that they didn't get the chopsticks to work to catch the booster. Mm-hmm. Isn't this, what other launch towers have chopsticks like this that maneuver in the way that this, is this like the
I don't know of any
kind?
I think it's the first of its kind. Yeah.
So regardless, if the catch ever comes to fruition, it's still a revolutionary design. Correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's revolutionary.
And it probably serves like a lot of purpose just in the lift mechanism compared to, I don't know, towers at the Cape.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there are kind of a couple of different ways that this is traditionally done. One of them is that you integrate the vehicle horizontally and you kind of wheel it out or roll it out on rails to your launch site. Right. And then you have this erector that basically raises it to vertical position by like next to your launch tower, right? And the other is you have vertical integration more sophisticated, more expensive, but better for your payloads, you have a big, tall building in which you, you know, you've got cranes and stuff to put the vehicle together, integrate the vehicle, and then you roll it out, often, you know, with the tower, and not necessarily, and you roll it out that way to the pad. This idea of you stack it at the tower with arms that are attached to the tower is, I'm not aware of that having been done before.
And why is that so beneficial, do you think?
Well, I think that it's pretty important for their concept of operations, especially for tanker flights, to be able to stack very quickly. So especially the booster turnarounds, right? You get this booster down, and what they want to be able to do is, you know, put it back up on the, you know, put it up on the launch mount, put up a new ship on top of it, field them both, and go again in a matter of hours, right? Or within a day. And that's also something that's never been done before. Right. It's just not done. It was never needed, right? SpaceX was the first company that achieved the cadence that Falcon 9 has achieved, and Falcon 9 is flying right now about once every 3 days on average. Hopefully by the end of the year, it'll be closer to every 2 days, using 3 launch pads. So no one's needed that kind of cadence, and so there wasn't a motivation to tackle that challenge of integrating at the launch pad, with this complex mechanism on the tower.
Yeah, I think it's that, like, literally just occurred to me right now of like, okay, I understand the skepticism about the catch, but it's still like, who else is doing this, you know? And it's probably no one.
Yeah, they keep, you know, biting off the stuff. They were like, can they really chew that? Like, why?
Right.
And then they keep chewing it.
Yeah, no, it's so, I mean, I'm just so, like, eternally thankful for SpaceX. You know, I just think, I don't want to, like, publicly criticize NASA too much, but man, am I just not excited about what they're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that SpaceX has brought back the excitement that we lost after the Apollo program.
Yeah, totally. Well, and they're also, you know, inspiring a lot of other startups that probably wouldn't have even existed if they didn't see what SpaceX was doing. Like, almost certainly wouldn't have existed.
Yeah.
Really,
I mean, it's very striking that most of these that we've had this gluttony of startups now, and funding for them. You know, it used to be considered a way to waste money, right? To invest in launch was, and I mean, yeah, most of these startups will probably go under, sadly, but it's still amazing that there's been so much investment into the industry, and so many people being trained up, and so many in so many companies, and working so hard to and passionately, and yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's SpaceX led the way.
Right. Yeah, no, it's, until then, you know, it was like, oh no, only NASA, only ESA, only JAXA. There's no way that a private company can do that. And boy, it's. Have you been to Starbase?
I haven't. I'm looking forward to going. I think once I mean, with baby and 2 older kids in tow, it's a little harder.
Yeah.
But once they're a little older, and once Starship's flying more regularly out of there, and I can be sure of catching one when I go, then I will go and probably take them too.
Right. Well, for sure, the videos, I mean, are in just, you know, the excitement, I think, is infectious, whether or not you're there in person. It's very cool in person, but it's amazing to see the worldwide sort of niche cult interest. You know, you have Marcus House, who lives in Tasmania, never been, and his whole full-time job is to cover this. It's like wild to me. It's crazy.
Yeah.
what do you think of SpaceX's approach to technical risk on Starship development? Do they need to be more conservative to avoid FAA mishap investigations, or should they push hard for full reusability?
Well, yeah, so I love their technological development approach. I'm a big fan of that approach. So there's two methods. One is extremely cautious. You design and analyze. It drives the cost super high, but you don't have a lot of public failures. The other way is you test early, test often, fail early, learn a lot.
Right.
And it's been proven that that is actually a more cost-effective way to do development. The only concerns are safety and look, the look, and if the look affects politics. So you can manage the safety, you can do that approach, and this gets into the FAA's role. The FAA is supposed to protect public safety and environmental regulations, and they're doing their job. But I think you can have both. I think SpaceX can do the rapid development. They can allow failures to happen. They can learn from it and make progress fast. And it can be done in a way that's not harming the environment and not risking the public. And I think the FAA is doing their job. I think they're doing a fair job. They've allowed SpaceX to launch twice so far. I'm sure we're going to have a third launch soon. So I think things are going well.
Yeah, no, I'm so excited for the third launch. It's it feels like it's very soon. So hopefully. If you like this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up. Please follow Ellie in Space or subscribe here on YouTube. It's completely free. And hey, leave your predictions in the comments for when you think the Starship launch is going to be. I've been hearing no earlier than Pi Day, which is March 14th, but we could be surprised by SpaceX.